Call to the Lamb quickly made a name for itself because of its cutesy art style and sinister theme. Overall, I had a very two-sided opinion of this game. I really enjoyed my playthrough, but a lot of systems in this game are just lacking depth, and that limited how much I wanted to keep playing this game. So let's get into it. Call to the Lamb is an action roguelite with two core gameplay components. First, you go on runs that consist of a standard action roguelite gameplay loop. Between runs, the secondary gameplay loop consists of an Animal Crossing-like management sim gameplay, where you manage a cult of devoted followers and worshippers. Both these game systems have intertwined progression and unlocks that we'll discuss later on, as well as some world building and storytelling. So let's talk about the action combat first. The gameplay structure of Call to the Lamb draws on a lot of familiar action roguelite elements. You navigate a grid-like map of rooms. When you enter each room, you have to clear it out of all enemies before moving on. As you clear each level or each subset of the run, you move on to new levels or new floors that have new options and rewards. At the start, you can choose to clear one of 4 main areas or biomes, and each have their own basic enemies and bosses. You have to clear each area 4 times. Each of these areas has a final boss or bishop that you have to fight in order to clear it and move on. Importantly, each run consists of one of these 4 areas only. Runs don't mix and match areas at all, so the enemies, bosses, biome, etc. of each area is fixed from the start. The combat itself is intuitive and very easy to pick up. You have a basic attack, a secondary attack or special ability called a curse, and a dodge roll. Both your basic attack and your curse can be changed by equipping new weapons and new curses that you find along your run. While you can use your basic attack as much as you want, curses require a special resource that you get from killing enemies. So you're limited in how often you can use your curse because of that. I did enjoy this curse resource management aspect because it was a nice way to limit how often you can use your curse without using that standard cooldown mechanic. Most basic attacks are pretty straightforward sweeping attacks. They're not very creative, but there are 1 or 2 weapons that have interesting attack chains or attack patterns. Like the claws, for example, that have a series of weak attacks followed by a powerful finishing attack. On the other hand, curses do have some more variety, though most of them are some form of ranged damage, like some curses that shoot out tentacles at your enemies, or other curses that are wide AoE attacks. As you progress through the game and unlock new things, you can find new modifiers for your weapons and curses, like weapons that occasionally heal you after you kill enemies, or curses that freeze enemies when they're hit. Enemies in this game do have a decent amount of variety. There are some melee enemies, some bullet hell type enemies, and there are some enemies with fairly straightforward movement and attack patterns. The game also does a good job of telegraphing enemy attacks before they happen, so there aren't any enemies that feel cheap or unfair when they hit you. That being said, between enemy attacks and the modest weapon and curse variety, this combat is fairly straightforward. There is of course room for mastery, but I don't think the skill ceiling is super high for Call to the Lamb compared to other action roguelites like Isaac, for example. It's also just not the most difficult game, and I only died a couple times during my playthrough. The build crafting feels similar to the combat, and that is decent, it's functional, but it's just not very deep. In addition to the combat encounters of each run, there are also non-combat rooms as well. Some of these are shops where you can buy upgrades, but most non-combat rooms give you free upgrades of some form, like new weapons, new curses, or tarot cards. These tarot cards are your staple buffs or upgrades that you find on a given run, and most of them are just simple stat buffs, like increased damage or increased health. But there are a few more creative ones with conditional effects, like increased damage at nighttime specifically. In addition to these tarot cards, there are a couple other build crafting elements. There are the weapon or curse variety that I talked about earlier. There's the cloak you equipped before each run. You can also bring followers with you in the form of summoned demons. First, cloaks are a way to favor different playstyles with certain drawbacks. For example, one cloak doubles your starting health, but limits your ability to heal during each run, while another cloak allows you to start with tarot cards already, but limits your ability to pick up new tarot cards during a run. You can also use your followers from your cult and transform them into demons that follow you around on your run and give you some buff or extra aid. Some demons might pick up items for you, while others might attack enemies on their own. I actually didn't play around with these demons for most of my playthrough because I thought that in order to use them, you had to permanently kill your followers, but in reality, you actually don't have to do that. It's a temporary transformation, so I would recommend starting to use these as soon as you can because they are quite powerful. I think all these elements on their own are fine, and they all work, but honestly, they just don't have a lot of cool synergies. it feels like most of these abilities and buffs are self-contained, and while they do of course stack together, I never got that cool feeling that I was breaking the game or creating some cool, super overpowered build or something like that. These buffs felt additive, but they never felt multiplicative. So now let's talk about the cult part of Cults of the Lamb. During each run, you can find new followers and worshippers for your cult, as well as collect resources to use in your new village. Between each run, you maintain and manage said cult. It's a nice relaxing gameplay loop if you like that management sim style of gameplay, and it provides a nice breather between runs. Managing your cult consists of a couple different elements. You have the resource management aspect, where you have your cult members collect wood and stone for you, for example, and you use that wood and stone to build new buildings, and you have your cult members manage a farm, for example, which you use to grow food and feed your tribe. When you first start out, a lot of these actions have to be done manually by you, but as you unlock more and upgrade more, you can automate most of this management of your cult. That being said, there are some management aspects that you can never fully automate, like sending followers on resource gathering missions and cooking their food for them. So even at the end of the game, you do always have to manage your cult actively in some capacity. What makes Cult of the Lamb differ from a standard management sim game are, of course, the cult elements. One of the main tasks you have your followers do is worship you, which gives you your main currency for unlocking new cult upgrades, like better buildings and the automation that I just talked about. And you can also hold sermons and rituals for your cult that give you large rewards and temporary buffs, like increased productivity for a couple days. Being a cult, of course, some of these rituals are not so nice. And you can sacrifice followers in many different ways to reap many different rewards and benefits. And you can always get more followers, so the game definitely encourages you to sacrifice your followers when you can. You can also bless and micromanage your followers individually in order to level them up, which increases their productivity, their power as summoned demons, and gives you more benefits later on if you end up sacrificing that follower. One thing I did quite like about Cult of the Lamb were the follower quests. After most runs, a follower will come up to you with a quest that they want you to do. These are usually small tasks like build a certain building or rescue their friend, aka another follower, from a certain area or biome. But there are also a lot of other random ones, like quests to make other followers eat dirt. It's pretty clear to me that some of these quests act as a tutorial of sorts, letting you know, for example, you can make your followers eat dirt or other foods if you want them to. But they also give you nice short goals to work towards and makes that playthrough more enjoyable. As a whole, I liked these management sim elements, and the progression of the unlocks felt nice. I had pretty much capped out on all the upgrades and new systems by the time I beat the game, which I guess in some ways is great pacing from the developers. I saw all the content right by the end, but on the other hand, by the end of the game, I didn't want to keep expanding or exploring and building up my village. I feel like I kind of already done all of what there was to do. The final gameplay elements that I want to talk about are the other pieces of side content you can do between runs. As you clear more areas, you discover more side areas that have some objective to work towards, some shop, or some minigame. For example, one of these areas gives you access to a fishing minigame and a quest involving a cult that lost their leader. Another side area allows you to play a dice game with some NPCs, and it was actually a fun little game. I thought these side quests were a great breather and change of pace from the rest of the game. You do also need to do the side content in order to unlock some important progression, some important upgrades. You won't spend hours fishing, you won't spend hours playing this dice game, but I did still enjoy it for what it was. Now let's talk about RNG and randomness in Cult of the Lamb. All things considered, Cult of the Lamb is not an RNG heavy game, but it does still come out in a couple of areas. Mostly, randomness affects the game in regards to your build, but you do also always have options to choose from. When you find new weapons or new tarot cards, for example, you're always given an option of 2 or 3 choices to choose from. So you can always pick which one you want out of those choices. Since different tarot cards and weapons don't have super important synergies, super powerful combinations, I never really felt held back by not getting a crucial item for my build, but at the same time, I was never super excited to find a certain card or weapon for a given build. As I said, the build crafting doesn't have those synergies, so that RNG wasn't as impactful there. The main RNG exception here that I will say is when you start each run, you're given only 1 weapon and 1 curse. This was usually fine because you can replace those curses and weapons with a new one pretty quickly, but there was once or twice where I got stuck with a weapon that I hated, mostly that slow hitting hammer, and that made those runs notably less fun and less enjoyable. In regards to the level layout, the areas are randomized, and what rewards you'll find along each run are also randomized. But that randomness mostly just added a bit of variety run to run. Again, it never felt super impactful. Additionally, since you pick one of the 4 areas at the start of each run, the possible variety in enemy types in each run is limited. You won't see all possible enemies for a given run, only enemies and bosses for that area, that biome that you chose. Each run is also pretty short. I think most runs I had in this game topped out at around 10 minutes for a standard run, so that more limited variety of being only one area, one biome, was definitely not a deal breaker. But if you do want to fight different enemies, you did choose that variety for yourself from the start. A nice small RNG element on each runs is that enemies can have randomized modifiers. This is not a new mechanic to roguelites, but it was nice to encounter different enemies now and then that drop bombs when killed, for example, or drop poison pools when hit, things like that. Another RNG mechanic is that different floors or different parts of each area can have different randomized modifiers, like one area giving double gold and another one allowing you to sacrifice a heart for an extra tarot card. Again, nothing game breaking here, but just some nice small variety and choices that added to the game in a nice way. Once you've cleared the 4th and final boss for each area, you can choose to replay those areas again. This will make those areas have harder enemies, and it will also randomize what boss you find along each run, and it adds some new bosses to the mix as well. Importantly, you can also choose to keep going after the final boss, similar to looping the game in some other roguelites like Risk of Rain. This does have some notable problems, one of which is that there aren't that many upgrades, there aren't that many tarot cards, so you kind of max out your build before too long, where you have most of the upgrades possible, and you can't stack upgrades, you can't repeat upgrades, so there is a soft cap on longer runs there, but you can still have runs that are fairly long. As I mentioned earlier, having each run be locked to one area was perfectly fine when the runs were 10 minutes long, but for these longer areas, I do wish they had added some more cross-area, cross-biome mixing and variety. Similar to how a game like Curse of the Dead Gods does it, where you have these different areas, but it culminates in this truly randomized, more variety-heavy, intense run. It just would add some more replayability and some more depth to the game, but I also understand why it doesn't really fit the structure of Call to the Lamb. So now let's talk about the progression and replayability in Call to the Lamb. This is a very progression-heavy roguelite, and this game is meant to be played as a journey across several runs as you build up your cult, as opposed to each run feeling more independent. Because of that, the cult building that I talked about earlier is probably the biggest form of progression, but there are a couple others as well. This game also has a ton of different cross-run progression currencies. Some of these make perfect sense as part of that city builder cult management side of the game. You have gold, the main currency used for buying most things. You have logs and ore you use to build buildings, and you can also refine them into planks and bars in order to create more powerful, higher tier buildings. And these made perfect sense to me, and were pretty consistent with a lot of other city builders that I played. But some of the other cross-run upgrades felt excessive in terms of how many different currencies there were. There was a different currency for cloak upgrades, town upgrades, and new building unlocks, cult event unlocks, a different curse and weapon unlock system, a different system for unlocking tarot cards, follower-specific levels and upgrades, and so on and so on. There were even 2 currencies that use the same icon, praying hands for followers or worship, and that confused me when I first started playing. It definitely felt like they added a bunch of different currencies in order to force you to engage with all the different pieces of side content. And I did end up engaging with all that side content, but I would have tried all that side content anyways without being forced to. And the whole progression structure just felt weirdly piecemeal and broken apart. Practically speaking, it wasn't a super big deal because, as I said, I engaged with all these systems anyways, so because of that, I got all these unlocks anyways, but it just felt cumbersome and a little weird. Most of these unlocks are ones you'll get eventually, but there is one system, notably Doctrines, where you have to make a permanent choice that changes your playthrough. One of these choices might be 2 types of rituals that give you different benefits, or a choice between 2 different passive buffs for your cult. I do wish there was a way to try out different options, but once you pick one, you're kind of stuck with it. I guess you can always start a new run and try out different things that way. Also of note, some of these upgrades are straight vertical progression, which is to say some of these upgrades make you strictly more powerful run to run. The most notable ones are the ones that level up all of your weapons and curses from the start, making them deal more damage. You also unlock more variety for those weapons and those curses, and that variety comes with more powerful, special, or secondary effects. Outside of those more vertical progression style unlocks, or unlocks that make you more powerful run to run, there are a lot of fun collection and completionist type unlocks. Different areas have their own sets of items and follower types that you unlock by playing through that area. These followers are stylized after a lot of different animals, and there's also a huge variety of decorations, like different sidewalks you can make for your followers, different statues, different lights, things like that. And they're all thematically based on the different theme of that biome that they come from. I didn't play around with these decorations much because that's something I never do in these types of games, but there's a pretty large catalog of options for those that want that. Overall, I think this progression fits the game, and very importantly, it has good pacing. I never felt like I stalled out anywhere or plateaued, and it always felt like you're unlocking more fun things. Honestly, they could have slowed that progression down, and it still would have been perfectly fine. But I think this game is missing out on some true endgame-like content. As I mentioned earlier, you can keep replaying old areas, and in order to complete one certain side area, you do have to do that. But once I pretty much got all those upgrades for the cult and beat the final boss of the game, completed the story, I grew bored of this gameplay loop and progression pretty quickly. I'd completed most of the unlocks, all of the bosses, but there was no New Game Plus or any option like that. This wasn't the end of the world because I still enjoyed my time with this game. It didn't get boring while I was playing it, but this was also only a 10-hour playthrough, which is less than I usually spend on roguelites. Cult of the Lamb has a very dark setting and world under those cutesy graphics. This game starts out when you're about to be sacrificed, but you end up being saved by an outcast god who promises you life in exchange for your service. You then progress the story by killing the 4 bishops, or old gods, who have your new patron god imprisoned. The story itself is fairly straightforward, but I really love the way that this world unravels before you. The bishops will interrupt you along your run, and they'll taunt you and provoke you in various ways, also providing some more lore about the world and more insight to what's happening. I especially loved the encounters like this with the 4th bishop. You also talk to NPCs on different side areas and can learn more from them about the world, their role in it, things like that. And I also absolutely loved the final boss encounter and the story finale. It was one of my favorite gaming moments of the year, though obviously I won't talk about it in more details because spoilers. So Cult of the Lamb does what is rare for roguelites and truly adds some great story and world building. And this world is one of the things that really brought this whole game together for me and made it a great overall experience. So what's my verdict on Cult of the Lamb? When I think of Cult of the Lamb, I think of the concept of Gestalt, which is the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, Cult of the Lamb is a game with a lot of pieces that are good and decent, but no single piece on its own is that amazing or spectacular. The combat, the build crafting, and the management sim qualities are all fun, but they're all simple and lacking some depth if they were on their own. But when brought together with the world, the story, the art design, Cult of the Lamb became a great overall experience for me, and I loved playing through it because of that. I would recommend this game to people who are looking to play a fun indie game more broadly. But if you want something more specific than that, like an amazing action roguelite specifically, or a complicated in-depth management sim specifically, you might find yourself disappointed. And it's definitely not a 100 hours plus game for me because of that lack of depth. Huge thank you and shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.